So welcome to another video. This is Chapter 2, and we'll be covering the following concepts. Planning a Windows Form application, Windows standards for interfaces, access keys, and tab order. Now, planning a Windows Form application, this can be simple or it can be quite complicated. Even with creating any kind of program, you've got to know what the program's supposed to do. Luckily for this class, we'll give assignments. The instructions will be somewhat clear of what needs to be done. Whenever there's a little bit of room for interpretation, it's good to probably ask me what needs to be done. You need to do at least the bare minimum of what the assignment is asking for. If you want to do a little bit more than that, that's okay. But out in the wild, if you're writing an application for a user, you got to try to figure out what the application's purpose is. Sometimes that's difficult because sometimes the end user doesn't really know what they want, which can sometimes cause problems. And what I normally like to try to do is to write down the kind of things that the application should do. And so, like, for example, here, you're trying to plan for what the application is supposed to do. You write down what the purpose is. You write down maybe some of the formulas or the basic flow of what the program is going to do. In this case, we're going to ask the user for the bill amount and then the tip percentage. And what the application is going to do is it's going to calculate what the total amount is. And then we're going to have a button to end the application. So moving along here, one of the things that I like to do is, and we're not really showing it here, I think it may be on the next screen, is quite often, I like to think of pictures worth 1,000 words. You can describe something to a user and they may think of a whole nother application. But if you can draw something out to be able to say, okay, this is what the application is going to look like. This is what it's going to, the second page of the application or the second part of the application is going to look like this. At least then you're putting down on paper, you're drawing that stuff out. And so that helps to eliminate communication issues that may occur. And what we're doing here is we're kind of doing the same thing, is that we're going to have this information, the bill amount and the tip percentage, and we'll have a text box that is called text bill, and we will have another text box that's called text percentage that allows the user to be able to enter in these two values. Then we'll have a calculate button that will calculate the total amount and display the tip amount, and a button to exit the application. So the final step is to draw a sketch of the application's user interface. And so if we scroll down here, here we go. We could have an image on there, some kind of waiter image for the application to make it look a little professional. One of the things I suggest that you do if you're writing applications is try to keep images to a minimum. I know that things look kind of plain Jane, but quite often things look better 10, 15, 20 years in the future if you don't get real fancy with a lot of things like adding images and tons of color and stuff like that. Usually sticking with the defaults for the type of text, all of that kind of stuff, just makes things simpler. So please keep that in mind. So here we're displaying a couple different ways. Here's a couple different ways of displaying the form. One is called a vertical arrangement, to where things kind of go from top to bottom. and here's horizontal where it kind of goes left to right. Now, it's really up to the user and up to the person writing the program what they want to do. Some of these things can be moved around pretty easily, so you don't want to spend a ton of time with trying to figure out exactly where things are supposed to go. But drawing something like this out for the end user to look at is a good idea because it allows them to really see what the application is going to look like. And like I said, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I found that out the hard way. It's usually better to go ahead and try to do something like this and then get a get some positive feedback from the end user and then make adjustments, whatever you have to do. So moving right along, guidelines for identifying labels and buttons. Generally, what we do is we will, before each item, each component, will put some kind of a label to identify what it is. Like, for example, back here, oops, did I go too far? No, like right here, these are labels: bill, tip, percentage, and tip. Those are the labels, and then these are the components here. For the output, you could write, calculated tip maybe right above this, and then of course you have your exit button. You don't necessarily have to have a label for an exit button because the label kind of goes on the button as we see here. So keep that in mind. That's usually the format that we kind of use for labels and buttons. Guidelines for including graphics. It's okay to add images if you want, but try to keep it to a minimum. Just because, to be honest with you, applications, even web pages that have images on them, they don't really age very well. In 5 or 10 years, they're going to look outdated, and you got to go in and make adjustments to it and all this kind of stuff. It's usually not a good idea. So try to keep pictures, things to an image, to a minimum. It is okay to have a few if you want, but don't go overboard with adding tons of images. Even though right now it may look cool, later on it won't. If we don't specify what the type should be, in most cases we'll want to use this, and I don't even know how to pronounce that. UI SEGOEUI font type. I think in most of the projects it tells you what to use, but if it doesn't, go ahead and default to this type. Generally, we don't want to use a ton of different font sizes. We only want to have 1 or 2 different font sizes. Avoid using italics and underlining because it just makes things difficult to read. Usually, the simpler, the better. Doesn't need to look real complicated. It just needs to be functional, but it needs to look decent. It shouldn't look horrible. Things should line up, stuff like that. But you don't have to go overboard with making things look really, really pretty. They just got to look presentable and kind of make sense. Guidelines for using color. I recommend that you don't use a whole lot of color unless there's instructions in the project to add some type of color. The reason for it is because, like it says here, color is very subjective. What may look pretty to one person won't look pretty to somebody else. Somebody may be colorblind. So it's better to leave that stuff out if you can. And then also usually going with the defaults is fine. If you want to if you want to explore a little bit on a project or something with having, adding a 1 or 2 things of color, feel free to do that. You can always comment that stuff out whenever you submit the project, or if it's minimal, it's probably okay to submit it. Because mostly what I'm gonna look for is if things look clean, you're getting the right output, stuff like that. And so if you have a few little things in there to where you're experimenting with color or whatever, that's okay. But don't go overboard with it. Access keys. quite often to help speed up like inputting data or to be able to get through the application faster. Quite often we can use access keys, like for example, Alt X allows you to be able to exit out of it. And for some of your other components, some of your other like text fields, you might want to specify uh, access keys that you can use to quickly get to those components to be able to type in data if you want to. So if the assignment asks you to do that, to add some access keys, go ahead and do what it says. If it doesn't say to do it, don't feel like you absolutely have to. It's just optional. And there will probably be a few assignments that have you do that. Tab order. Um, each control has a tab index property that contains a number. This begins with 0, and so as you hit the tab key, it'll go from each component bouncing to another component. So if somebody wants to do very quick data entry, they can hit the tab key and move directly to the next item without having to use the mouse. This allows for very quick data entry if a person wants to use that. So if the assignment asks for you to be able to have a certain tab index order, go ahead and add that. If it doesn't specify it, then don't worry about adding it. If you would like to go ahead and add a tab index for quick tabbing through your project, feel free to do that. But unless the assignment asks for it, it isn't necessary. Just know what this is, so that way if you do need to add in for quick tabs, you can do that. So for example, down here, we have these different components. And actually, I don't really like putting tab indexes on labels because you're not going to be entering data into the label. You're just going to be entering it into the text component and so on. So or to be able to hit a button to calculate things. So to me, it seems kind of silly to have these, but if the assignment tells you to specify, okay, that like for example, label 1 needs to have an index of 0, and label 2, which is the tip percentage, needs to be index value of 2, go ahead and follow the instructions. But if there's no instructions or if it's vague, feel free to skip over the labels. There's really no need to have the labels to have a tab index unless it specifies it. Okay, I think that's about it for this lecture. Feel free to read this chapter if you need to. I've just kind of hit the highlights here of what I think is really important, things that you will need to know. Feel free to go back and read other parts. If something doesn't seem clear or if you have questions, let me know.